Welcome to our special event, POGG Canada. And sorry for being a few minutes late. We've never quite had a crowd this big, and it's appreciative that you thought that the issues that we're dealing with today merited your attendance. Thank you very much. My name is Edgar Simpson, and I'm president of POGG Canada, Public Affairs Fellowship, better known as POGG Canada. I'd like to welcome you for this special presentation of our Canadian Values Award and the address of our special guest, Professor Jordan Peterson. Firstly, most of you here today are wondering what is POGG Canada. POGG stands for Peace, Order, and Good Government, which are the opening lines in our Canadian Constitution that states the primary goal of our Canadian government is to provide said peace, order, and good government to all Canadians. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether we have been well served in this endeavor since 1867. POGG Canada is a public affairs grassroots thinking tank that was founded in Ottawa in 2004. We're a non-profit, non-partisan organization that explores a wide range of public affairs issues through a monthly breakfast meeting discourse between knowledgeable special guests and our members. When our members think a topic merits more insight, special committees are formed to study and the issues, write policy and position papers that reflect our POGG membership views on these important public affairs issues of the day. Over the years, some of our POGG position papers have been on immigration, Canadian values, Aboriginal issues, healthcare, and the defense of Charlotte Whitten. We have created 2 annual POGG Canada Awards, the National Golden Whistle Award, in which we recognize the integrity and courage of men and women that speak out against corruption, malfeasance, and bad policy in governments across Canada. And our Canadian Values Award, which I shall speak of shortly. We strive to live up to our role model, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and speak up about the issues that matter to all Canadians. Before proceeding into our program, I'd like to recognize some members of our audience in alphabetical order and not importance. Brian Lee Crawley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute here in Ottawa, one of Canada's finest think tank. Brian? David Harris, founder of Insignia Strategic Research, an internationally recognized expert in terrorism and a frequent media commentator on issues related to terrorism and defense. David? Tom Harris, Executive Director of International Climate Science Coalition, Canada's leading opponent. Canada's leading opponent of the prevailing climate change orthodoxy. Ian Lee, I'm seeing Ian. Oh, okay. Hopefully Ian will be here. So Ian is a member of our board, and and most people know that he's a professor at Carleton University Sprott School of Business, and a radio and television commentator on economic issues. Fred Litwin, founder and president of Free Thinking Film Society and the chair of POGG Canada. John Robson, did he arrive yet? Well, when he does, most people know John just by listening to TV and radio and reading newspaper. Professor of American History at University of Ottawa, National Post newspaper columnist, commentator at large on radio and television, and a documentary filmmaker. His most recent, Magna Carta, Our Shared Legacy of Liberty. So hopefully you'll have a chance to chat with John about that. David Shackleton. Oh, sorry, David. David is the president of the Ottawa chapter of the Canadian Association for Equality of Men and Women, with an emphasis on the unfunded and ignored men's right. And I'm told that David's organization has a special function coming up shortly. I encourage you to go to their website and learn about it. It sounds fascinating. Robert Sibley, author of several books, a senior writer with the Ottawa Citizen, and a professor in modern political thought at Carleton University. Robert? And Harry Weldon, the founding president and the chairman emeritus of POGG Canada. Thank you all for being here today. This afternoon's event will begin with the presentation of POGG Canada's Canadian Values Award. 2007, a special POGG committee was tired of hearing our political leaders raise the issue of Canadian values at every election cycle without explaining what that value was and why it should be defended. Our committee developed a list of what they thought were fundamental Canadian values in the hope of encouraging Canadians to discuss and add to this list, and most importantly, protect it from attack. Some of these self-evident core Canadian values need to be repeated and are freedom of thought, belief, opinion, speech, freedom of assembly and association, gender equality, equality of opportunity, freedom of religion, individual responsibility, economic freedom, and prosperity through free market. And there are more, and we encourage you to get involved in making sure we protect them. In 2010, we created our Canadian Values Award in the recognition of the outstanding contributions and leadership in the furtherances and the defense of these Canadian values. Our first recipient was Andre Drouin, town councillor from Pierreville, terrible pronunciation, but Quebec, who developed and passed a list of key Canadian values that the town council thought new immigrants to their town and indeed Canada should aspire to and uphold in order to better fit into their new Canadian homeland. 2011, our recipient was Fred Litwin, founder and president of Free Think and Film Society of Ottawa, an organization dedicated to celebrating films on freedom and democracy, many of which resulted in protests and attempted banning to keep them from being shown. The professor will be right there with you on that. In 2014, our recipient was Celine Mansour, Associate Professor of Political Science at Western University, national columnist for QMI and the Toronto Star. Celine was awarded for his defense of Canadian values from erosion and exclusion in our prevailing policy of multiculturalism in Canada. And we come to today. Just before the presentation, following the award presentation, Professor Peterson will address us on the issue that has brought him to here today and has brought such great attention to his life at the moment. Following his address, there will be a question and answer period, which is a very POGG event. We encourage every attendee to ask the question. And we won't let Jordan go until they're all answered. We're going to stop this time. At this time, I'd ask our chairman, Fred Litwin, to introduce our award recipient.
Thank you, Edgar. This is not my speech, by the way. Talking about Canadian values, and I've had this discussion a lot with Harry about what are Canadian values. You know, a true Canadian value, if you really want real Canadian values, perhaps anti-Americanism a Canadian value. Frivolousness might also be a Canadian value. Condescension. I like one, affected outrage. I say this, I mean, remember back when, after 9/11, George Bush went before both houses of Congress And he gave a speech, and he thanked all the various countries that had been helping out, and he forgot to mention Canada. And the truth was that the speechwriters forgot, but they did remember, but the speech had already been locked down because they had a very, very rigorous procedure on speeches in the White House. And so they went ahead with the speech, and of course in Canada we went crazy. You know, the Western democracies were under attack, and we were hand-wringing like, oh my God, you didn't thank Canada, what's wrong with them, you know, it's horrible. You know, that to me is sort of a Canadian value, is it not? And that's why I think that it's very important to give awards like this today and to start talking about Canadian values, because you know, it's great, we have a couple of pages here of what we consider to be Canadian values, but do we practice them? Do Canadians agree on these values? These are the sort of discussions that we need to have. The 2 pages that I have here, this is from a report that POGG did a few years ago, trying to determine just what are Canadian values. Edgar talked about freedom of expression, the various freedoms. Fraternity. Fraternity is one of the Canadian values on this list, and I think that's probably the most underused value. Fraternity, that we're all in this together. Doesn't matter your religion, your ethnicity, your nationality. We're all in this together, and we need to talk, I think, more about fraternity. I can go on because I'm putting this up online the next little while so people can actually look at this little report on Canadian values. But enough of me talking. It's always nice to talk when I have a full house and a captive crowd. The only thing you need to know about Dr. Jordan Peterson is he was born in Alberta. Okay, I'm done introducing him. No, Dr. Peterson was born in Alberta, and he got his PhD in clinical psychology. He's a tenured professor at the University of Toronto, but he's also taught at Harvard. And we're very, very fortunate that we have brave people like Dr. Peterson who are willing to stand up, who are willing to say no, willing to fight for a very important freedom of expression, that many other people wouldn't fight. And as you know, what goes on in university these days is absolutely horrifying. And way too many professors are completely silent, completely complicit in what's happening. So it's very fitting today to honor somebody who really embodies the Canadian values that we hold dear in this organization, and which we hope that more Canadians would hold dear. It's very fitting to honor Dr. Jordan Peterson. So I'd like to ask Dr. Peterson to come up and accept this award from POGG Canada. Harry, would you come up as well? Harry Weldon was the originator of this award. Harry is the founder of POGG, and it just wouldn't be right to give out this award without having Harry up on stage with me as well. So Dr. Peterson, I want to thank you very much for embodying what we believe are true Canadian values, and we were with you in this fight, and we will do whatever we can to help you in future months, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Peterson?
Well, thank you very much. It's been quite a day. It's not often that you get denounced and accused of disseminating hate propaganda and get a values award in the same day. So, well, I should tell you what's happened to me over the last 2 months. It's been extraordinarily surreal, I would say is the right term. Like a Hieronymus Bosch painting, something like that. I'll give you a little background. I've been studying totalitarianism, the psychology of totalitarianism, for a very long time. I wrote a book in 1999 called Maps of Meaning, which was the culmination of, I figured I put about $15,000 of writing into it. It's a very long book, it's very difficult. And I think I rewrote every sentence in that book at least 20 times. I worked on it for 3 hours a day for 15 years. And I was interested in it
my fundamental interest was this, essentially. I read this story once about something that happened at Auschwitz. And it was one of the many horrifying things that I read about, sort of saturating myself in the relevant literature on totalitarian atrocity. Not so much just totalitarianism, but I was interested in the worst elements of totalitarianism. And the worst elements of totalitarianism are pretty bad, let me tell you. I read things that took me to years to get out of my mind. I mean, I know that that's nothing like living through them, that's for sure, but it was bad enough. And this was a story that comes from Auschwitz, and I know in Auschwitz they had an infamous sign right over one of the gates that said, "Work will make you free." It's like, and then this was an example of how work made people free in Auschwitz. And so, you know, if you got delivered to Auschwitz, you'd already been stripped of your belongings and stripped of your dignity and stripped of your family, and maybe you had several family members die with you or near you when you were crammed into a cattle car being transported across the European landscape. And then when you got to Auschwitz, because that wasn't really enough for the people that were hell-bent on your torture and then your death, one of the tricks that the camp guards used to pull was to have the inmates newly delivered to the camp pick up a 100-pound sack of wet salt and then carry it from one side of the camp compound to the other and then back. Now you see, the and then back, that's a really important part of that story, because as Alexander Solzhenitsyn pointed out when he was working in the Gulag Archipelago labor camps, if you're building a brick wall or something like that, even if you're a prisoner, you at least have the meaning that comes with putting the damn wall together. You know, you can scrape some semblance of significance out of the horror show that's become your life. But to have someone carry a sack of wet salt from one side of the camp to the other, and then back, indicates absolutely precisely, more than anything else could, that your labor value has been reduced to less than zero. And it's a parody, right? It's a parody of work, just like the sign was a parody of work. And then there's a terrible black humor that underlies such things. And we saw the same thing occur, for example, with the doctrine of mutual assured destruction in the 1960s. MAD, right? Somebody had the gall to generate that acronym. That was an example of the worst element of destructive humor. So I was interested in this situation in Auschwitz, and I was interested in it for psychological reasons, because I wanted to know psychologically what it meant that human beings could do that. And we like to think that the people who do those sorts of things, that act as Auschwitz camp guards do, aren't people like us, right? They're other people. They're the Nazis, for example, or they're the committed communists. But I can tell you something, and this is what I teach my students, because I have a class on this that's based on my book. What I'm trying to convince my students is, and this is not something safe, and it's designed to terrify them, I'm trying to convince my students that had they been in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, that had they had the opportunity to serve as an Auschwitz camp guard, they wouldn't have been in the tiny minority of heroes who put themselves on the line. They would have been in the vast majority of people who were perfectly willing to let starving and destroyed inmates carry sacks of wet salt from one end of the camp compound to the other and then back. And so I'm hoping that by the time my students are done with my course, they have some sense of the absolute blackness that resides at the bottom of their soul, and they're scared enough of who they might be so that they can live decent, honorable, and truthful lives, so that if that opportunity ever rises again, they'd have enough courage to say no. And I'll tell you that has nothing to do with making the university into a safe space. It's quite the bloody contrary, because in my estimation, if you're not being terrified out of your skin when you're learning something, especially in the humanities and social sciences, you're not learning a damn thing. So I spent all this time writing this book and looking deeply into the psychology of political belief. I was interested in the political career when I was a kid. I used to work for the NDP when I was 14, time I was 14 to 18. I worked for Rachel Notley's parents, actually. I knew Rachel very well, and I have to say that I don't believe that her parents would be happy with what her government is doing. I mean, Sandy Notley, who was her mother, was one of the... My father played a major role in my educational history. He taught me to read when I was a very young man, very young child, and I read voraciously. But it wasn't really until I hit junior high school that I started to read literature, I would say, and that was in large consequence because I used to go hang out at the junior high library with Sandy Notley, who was a very eccentric person, New Englander, but very, very educated. And all the delinquents used to hang out in the library, which gives you some, some indication of her character, because like, what the hell, that's no place for delinquents to hang out. You're supposed to be behind the school drinking vodka and smoking cigarettes and hanging out in the library. But we used to go out there and hang out with Sandy Notley because she treated us like we were thinking people, which was really quite a remarkable thing, because we probably weren't, but she did treat us that way. And she gave me a lot of books to read. So Sandy gave me Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was of course a real shocker, and also 1984 and Brave New World, and a whole smattering of books from George Orwell, and Ayn Rand. She had me read Ayn Rand too, which was a hell of a thing for a committed socialist to do. So I read Atlas Shrugged, and I read, what the hell else did she write? Atlas Shrugged.
Fountainhead.
The Fountainhead, yes, of course. And so what was so interesting about her was that she was really trying to educate, right? It was like, here's a whole diverse range of opinions, as diverse as you could possibly get. She was very much concerned with the degeneration of ideological commitment into tyranny. And anyways, and Grant Notley at that point was the only person in Alberta who wasn't a conservative, progressive conservative. He was the leader of the NDP, right? And every single person in the legislature, except for him, was a progressive conservative, because Alberta likes to, serially elect dictatorships and only overturn them about once every 30 years. And so I got a real inside view of what I would think about as classic Canadian socialism, sort of in that CCF tradition, the tradition that gave us our healthcare system and our pension plan. And it was sort of grounded in the Saskatchewan tradition of cooperatives, and it was a form of British socialism, essentially, quite distinct from the more radical forms of communism that played such a devastating role in much of Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union and so forth. And I went through quite a crisis of belief, I guess, two crises of belief when I was an adolescent. The first was that I sort of abandoned whatever religious beliefs my parents would have had. My mother in particular went to the United Church, and I couldn't tolerate that after the time I was about 12 or 13, because I had a fairly lengthy conversation with the minister about evolution and concluded very rapidly that whatever it was that the United Church was teaching about evolution had very little to do with what I understood evolution to be, and so that was quite hard on my mother, I would say, although I found it quite freeing to not be doing that, at least at the time. And then I turned, I suppose, in a sense, to socialism, which is something, it's a classic, right? Because one of the things that happens when a society loses its religious presuppositions is that people turn to ideology as a substitute, I would say. A poor substitute, I would say, a dangerous substitute. I heard once, I heard this when I was at a meeting, I don't remember why, I was at a meeting with Preston Manning, because I got to know him briefly when he was at the University of Toronto. I heard a meeting where a Gallup poll was discussed, and the Gallup people had determined that if you were a lapsed Catholic in Quebec, you were 10 times more likely to be a separatist, which I felt was, pretty much exactly what you'd expect. You leap from one belief system. What do? You leap from one belief system into absolute chaotic nihilism. It's like, no, that happens to people. It's really not good. But an alternative to that is just to leap into another form of meaning-centered ideology, and that. So, anyways, I had kind of high-level access, weirdly enough, when I was only a 14-year-old kid to the leaders of the socialists in Canada, because I met Roy Romanov and I met Ed Broadbent and a whole smattering of labor union leaders and so forth. And I was up at night when they were drinking and singing the Internationale at 2 in the morning. And one of the things that really struck me was that, and I found Grant Notley a very admirable person, and I found the people that I met at the sort of highest levels of the socialist leadership also admirable people. And I think that's because they were sort of George Orwell type socialists, right? And George Orwell, for those of you who don't know, tried to trade himself out of his middle class prejudices against the working class by engaging in a variety of very, very difficult working class jobs, and by covering the plight of the working class, especially in his famous book, Road to Wigan Pier, which is an absolutely remarkable, remarkable book. And so I found these people quite admirable and believed that the concerns of the working class were certainly something that bore serious consideration, which of course I still believe. But I also got acquainted with the lower level party functionaries, and I wasn't so thrilled about them. And I couldn't put my finger on it, and I couldn't really put my finger on it until I read George Orwell's Road to Whig and Peer, and I think it was about 17 when I read that, and I just started college. And two things happened. I had a roommate who was a real good cynic, and he was a kind of a tough kid. He worked at lead smelters and in the oil patch, and he was smart, and his father was a longshoreman, and they were fighters, and they were tough people. And he was pretty skeptical about my socialist utopianism, and so it was interesting to talk to him. But then I also read this book by Orwell, and Orwell did an analysis in the second half of the book, which became infamous, because he wrote Road to Whig and Peer, which is about the coal miners in the northern UK, and the absolutely god-awful lives they had. I mean, so, for example, they were pretty much done by the time they were in their mid-40s, right? No teeth, black lung, bent over, done, worn out, joints gone, done. And that was partly because of the absolute grueling nature of their work and their appalling living conditions as well. But, so, for example, if you were a coal miner in the 1930s in the northern UK, you started your day with a 2-mile walk to work, except where you were walking was in a coal shaft, and it was only about 5 feet high, and so that meant that you had to bend over. And Orwell, who was tall, said that after 200 yards of walking bent over like that, he could hardly even breathe, and these damn coal miners would do that in the morning just to get to the face of the coal mine, where they would then spend 8 hours a day, grinding rock off rock walls and breathing in coal dust for their 8 hours, and then they would have their little 2-hour commute walking down the damn mine shaft just to get back home, right? And so, anyway, so Orwell went up there and documented all of that, and wrote a really powerful piece about the plight of the working class for the English Left Book Club. But then, in the second half of the book, he wrote an analytical essay about the phenomena of middle-class socialism, and he was curious about the typical middle-class socialist intellectual, basically called them tweed-wearing, leather patch-wearing, sanctimonious hypocrites, fundamentally, and he couldn't understand why the hell people like that would be interested in the plight of the working class, because they shared almost nothing in common with them, and had really nothing but contempt for them. And I think that's echoed very much now, say, with the attitude of the Democrats in the US to the working class, which they now treat with complete contempt. And certainly the working class bit them very hard 2 weeks ago, because of course the Rust Belt went Republican. And people are damn desperate in the United States when the unemployed Rust Belt workers vote Republican. Something's gone seriously wrong. But I know lots of intellectuals like the Democratic left intellectual types, and they're exactly the sort of people that Orwell wrote about. He said that these middle-class intellectual socialists didn't like the poor. They just hated the rich. And that's really different. Seriously, it's so different. It's a completely different set of motivations, and they claim compassion because there's a social justice warrior type who will be bleeding compassion all over you every step of the discussion. But the hatred for the rich, let's say, or for the successful, or for anybody who has any power or standing or authority of any sort, who's not at the absolute bottom of the dominance hierarchy, has nothing to do with care for the people that are at the bottom. It has everything to do with unbelievable resentment at the daring that there could be anyone else out there in the world that has anything that they don't. And I find it absolutely appalling, especially at the university campuses, because if you look at the university campus like Yale, because Yale is very much infected by social justice warrior types, those people, the students there who are protesting, are so privileged that it's almost unimaginable, right? They occupy the top 1% of the 1% if you include the dimension of comparison to include, let's say, all the people in the world, which you might as well, and also everyone who has ever lived, and yet they have the gall to complain about that even tinier fraction of the population that has slightly more status than they do right now. But I mean right now, because everyone knows that if you're an 18 or 19-year-old Yale student, you're a baby 45-year-old multimillionaire. And the universities sure know that, the private universities in the United States, and I know this full well as a consequence of teaching at one for 7 or 8 years, the universities know absolutely that these young people are what would you call it, the ruling class in training, and bend over backwards to treat them properly, because they know full well that by the time they come into their 40s, they're going to be, most of them, many of them, are going to be controlling large fortunes and will be donating heavily to the universities. So, as far as see, they want it both ways, and I've had students like this, they want it both ways, eh? They want to be members in training of the ruling class and have every privilege that goes along with that, and at the same time, they want to identify with the oppressed, call themselves one of the oppressed, so they can have all the advantages of being oppressed and all the advantages of being powerful at the same time. God, it's sickening. It is. It's appalling. And you know, I was talking to an interviewer named Dave Rubin the other day on YouTube, and Rubin has quite a following, and he was talking to me about the good intentions of the young social justice warriors, and I don't buy that at all. I think that they're being enticed to play this double-edged game that's basically grounded in resentment, and I don't see anything of true compassion in that. And I'm also very skeptical about people's claims to true compassion. If someone comes up to you and says, I'm compassionate, I'm feeling sorry for victimized people, I'm going to do what I can to help them, the first thing I think is just exactly what makes you think you're so good. Because people aren't good. I'm no Rousseauian, you know. I know from my studies, I know full well that, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil goes down every human heart. And just because someone comes up to you and says, well, I'm on the side of the oppressed, does not mean that they are on the side of the oppressed. And I'm sick and tired of hearing that from the social justice warrior end of the conceptual universe. It's like they've established the moral high ground, and anyone who dares to question their motivations or their dialogue or their damned language is immediately put into the category of perpetrator/predator. And I know why that is too, because we've studied this. So there's a personality dimension called agreeableness. There's 5 canonical personality dimensions, by the way. They're very, very well established. I would say it's one of the most fundamental facts of social science. So the first dimension is extroversion. Extroverted people are happy and gregarious and assertive. They like being around people. They're energized by people. And introverts are quiet and reserved. They're not timid. They're quiet and reserved. They'd rather be by themselves. And the company of other people tends to tire them out. And so that's a positive emotion dimension, basically, and people vary in the degree to which they experience positive emotion and their threshold for positive emotion. And the second dimension is a trait called neuroticism, and neuroticism is a negative emotion dimension. And so people who are high in negative emotion or neuroticism have higher levels of avoidance and withdrawal, and that's associated with anxiety and depression, let's say. The third dimension, or our third dimension, is conscientiousness, and conscientious people are industrious and orderly. And orderliness, by the way, is the best predictor of conservative political belief. And the conservatives are orderly. And perhaps that comes as no surprise, except it's one thing to say that, and it's another to document it psychometrically and scientifically so that it can be measured. Next dimension is openness, and open people are, you can divide it into 2. They're interested in ideas, that's the intellect component, and they're interested in aesthetics, and that's the artistic component, and so that's another source of fundamental variation. And then the last dimension is agreeableness, and agreeable people are compassionate and polite, and the best predictor of political correct belief is compassion. And the reason that this is so relevant is because it's a maternal dimension. So women are higher in agreeableness than men, and that's biological, by the way. It's not a social construction phenomenon, it's a biological phenomenon. Now we know this because as the Scandinavian countries have become more and more egalitarian in their political landscape and socio-political landscape, the differences in personality between men and women in Scandinavia have been getting larger and larger. And the reason for that, technically speaking, is that if you take a society and you flatten out the socio-political landscape and eliminate all the variation that's a consequence of the environment, you maximize the biological differences. You don't minimize them. And those studies are definitive. And I would say they're also now illegal, thanks to Bill C-16. You know, I'm kidding, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I truly believe that. So anyway, so that's some of the background with regards to the work that I do. And about a month ago, 2 months ago, another thing that was happening to me that was kind of strange was that I have this clinical practice. I see people for about 20 hours a week, and I've done that for it's got to be 20 years. So I've got about 20,000 hours of clinical practice in there. And so about 15% of my clinical practice in the last 5 years have been people who've been driven out of their minds by their politically correct colleagues. I'm serious. And so one was a social worker, and one was a university employee, and the other was a bank employee. And these were sensible people, you know, and they were driven mad. One of them was driven mad by this happened. I swear to you that this happened. So this is at the Toronto Dominion Bank. So she was tortured by an email exchange between her superiors about the term flip chart. And so because they didn't like the term flip chart, and the reason for that, apparently, I didn't even know this, but there's always insults you don't know about, so I guess you learn something every day. Flip is apparently a pejorative that can be used to describe Filipinos. Who knew? And hypothetically, there were some Filipinos who weren't very happy with the word flip chart, and so I received from my client an email string of 13 emails describing flip chart and its absolutely oppressive consequence for these hypothetically offended Filipinos, and they decided to ban the word from the bank. Well, this woman was a refugee from Eastern Europe, from East Germany, and you know, she'd lived through the horrors of the totalitarian East, and well, she just had no way of processing this and couldn't reconcile herself to working in an organization where that sort of thing could actually become a priority. So there was that in the background. And then I got word from another client that the University of Toronto was going to make anti-racism and anti-bias training mandatory for its staff. And that really irritated me because, look, really, you're really going to subject your damn employees to political re-education? You really think that's okay? It's like it's not okay. And so not only is it not okay, but the theory upon which the damn re-education is based is bogus. So all these people talk about this test called the implicit association test that hypothetically shows that people are biased against members of whatever group isn't their own. And there's a fair bit of debate about what that damn test means in the scientific literature, because one of the things that happens is you're faster in associating negative words with a race that isn't yours than you are at associating positive words with a race that isn't yours, for example. But we don't know what that means. It might just be a novelty thing, right? Because novel things for human beings are somewhat dangerous and negative, although they have a positive aspect. And so we don't know if people are doing this association because they're afraid of novelty, or if they're why they're doing it. And it's not a very reliable test anyways, which means if you give it to the same person more than once, you don't get the same results. But that doesn't stop anybody from claiming that it's a valid indicator of your unconscious racism. Now, you think, and then worse, because now there are educational organizations that have sprung up all over that offer to educate your staff out of their unconscious biases, even though there is no evidence that those unconscious bias training programs work, and there's substantial evidence that they actually make the problem worse. Maybe because people don't like being labeled racists for their implicit attitudes, and maybe because they don't like being trotted before a mandatory anti-racism and anti-bias training program to sort out their souls by their erstwhile employers. And the Human Resources and Equity Department at the University of Toronto is a much more malevolent organization than that. And I'm saying that partly because I found out eventually what equity means, right? Because what the hell does that mean? And for those of you that run organizations or happen to be ensconced within them, you can be sure that your Human Resources and Equity Department is a social justice warrior fifth column, and you better watch the hell out. And I'm warning you about that, and I know what I'm talking about. So anyways, they did go forward with their anti-racism and anti-bias training program despite my complaints and despite me pointing out that they were taking advice from the Black Liberation Collective, which is an organization of I don't know how many people, but it's run by it was organized by two women who are unsavory, is to say the least of it. One of them is a black suprematist who has announced publicly that white people are inferior because they don't have enough melanin in their skin. And hypothetically, melanin is this chemical that enables you to transform cosmic energy into wisdom. And she's tweeted some very, very nasty things. She was also the woman who called a black speaker from Ethiopia at the free speech debate a coon, so that tells you exactly what sort of person she is. And then the second one who established this group is under investigation by the University of Toronto Student Union for embezzling $300,000 from the Student Union, which was 10% of their total budget, and organizing anti-racism demonstrations every time someone tries to call her on it. And they have a website on which they posted their support for let's call them non-violent ways of transforming Canadian society because of its appalling, corrupt and oppressive nature. And that's the people that the University of Toronto Human Resources and Equity Department are taking advice from. And when I called them on it, they said, well, we don't agree with everything they say. It's like, yeah, well, maybe you shouldn't be announcing the fact that they're serving as policy advisors to you, because a person who's a bit sensible might think that if one of the major administrative departments of the preeminent, perhaps, educational institution, Canada, is taking policy advice from you on how to train their employees, that might indicate that you have a little bit of support for their goals. But no, that instead of that becoming the issue, what I've been doing has become the issue because I'm not going to use the pronouns that radical leftist social justice warriors who are bent on dominating the linguistic landscape insist that I use. And that's the state of the modern university. So, anyways, I posted these videos on September 27th, and within a week there was 2 demonstrations at the University of Toronto. One formally criticizing me, which wasn't very well attended, and then another, a free speech rally that students organized spontaneously. It was organized by a student from Hong Kong who has a reason to be interested in the issues of free speech, let me tell you. And I was invited to speak along with Lauren Southern of Rebel Media, and when we got there and were speaking, the professional activist types came out en masse, and they had organized large loudspeakers, and so every time it was an open mic session, by the way, they could have talked, so I was going to talk, and then Lauren was going to talk, but then the mic was available for anyone who wanted to speak. Anyways, they brought these huge loudspeakers and blasted white noise at us and drowned me out with cries of shame and unplugged the microphone and ran off with it. And then this culminated, quite interestingly, with an attack on Lauren Southern by one of the professional activist types, which was captured on video. And then after the attack, this person was enraged, and I actually had a tiny bit of sympathy for the person, because people get upset at rallies saying, you can imagine that someone gets upset and does something stupid. It's like, yeah, well, that's not very bright, and it wasn't very bright, and they were charged by the police for that, by the way. But the worst thing that happened after that was that this little horrible person who's been named Smugly Puff and is now infamous on the internet did something that I felt was far more appalling, because the first person was consumed by anger, let's say, and okay, whatever, you're impulsive and you did something stupid, but you can kind of relate to that because you're impulsive and you do stupid things too. Maybe not quite that stupid, but probably, if you look over the course of your life. But then this little Smugly Puff person came up, the police had rushed in to stop this from happening, and this person rushed forward with this terrible, terrible grin on her face and said, I didn't see anything, officers, I didn't see anything, nothing happened here. And then she smiled like that, which meant there isn't a damn thing you can do to me if I lie outright to your face. And then she gave Lauren Southern the finger and wandered back into the crowd. Well, she was later charged by the police because she had swiped passerby's telephone after accusing them of being white supremacists. They just happened to be wandering by and stopped at the conference. And anyway, she's pretty famous on YouTube now, I would say, and I would also say justly so. Anyways, that's corrective, I would say. She lied outright and believed at the same time that there was nothing that would be done about it, and gloried in that, and that's not good. And So anyways, that attracted an awful lot of attention. I would say there's probably 4 million people that have watched that on YouTube now. Something like this has become an unbelievable YouTube phenomenon. Since I released those videos, there's been 140 press articles all over the world, mostly in Canada, but all over the world. It's been news for 8 weeks. It's like, what the hell? You know, you get your 15 minutes of fame by making some outrageous claim, but to have this going on for 8 weeks is absolutely unparalleled. And I would say, it's not like the attention is shrinking. The attention, like for example, I was on a program this week by Dave, I think I mentioned it, Dave Rubin's program, and he has about 300,000 YouTube followers. And I'm going to go talk to Mark Stein in December, and also a guy named Joe Rogan. And so there's going to be a tremendous amount of American attention paid to this particular issue. And so, well, so the next thing that happened was that the university sent me 2 warning letters, and the first warning letter basically said that I was responsible for following university policy and for following the legal requirements that are laid out in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And that I was to cease making my comments, announcing my intention not to use these gender-neutral pronouns. And when I got the letter, I read it. The first thing that happened was they outlined some of the things that I said. And so I looked at the letter. I said, "Look, you should take this letter back because you didn't do a very good job of writing it. Because if you're going to accuse me of something, you should actually accuse me of what I said instead of this sort of paraphrase nonsense that you put at the beginning of the letter. I know why you're doing this, and it's fine, but you should get the letter right." But they weren't smart enough to take the damn letter back, so I've got it. And then 2 weeks later, they sent me another letter, which was worded more strongly. And the letters were interesting too, because, of course, I wasn't certain that my interpretation of the legislation was correct, not being a lawyer, for example. But I read the policy guidelines on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, which by the way, the Ontario Human Rights Commission is the most seditious and dangerous organization in Canada, in my estimation. If we had any sense at all, we would abolish it instantly. So you may know or you may not know, but that there are a number of tribunals that are associated with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, including the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, and you may or may not know that they have been grouped, there's 8 of them now, that have been grouped under the term social justice tribunals. And so that's what we have in Ontario. We have 8 social justice tribunals, and these are extrajudicial organizations, and they can and do ruin your life. Now, I went and talked to a top constitutional lawyer in Canada, one of Canada's top constitutional lawyers, about 2 weeks after this all started, because I actually asked him about some libel that I thought I'd been subjected to because people were calling me racist because I objected to the Black Liberation Collective. It's like, I don't care if you're what your damn race is, if you're crazy and corrupt, I'm going to call you on it. And I think that's a pretty good definition of not being racist fundamentally. You know, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm race blind because I don't think anyone could say that, but you know, I do my best to be a decent person and to meet people one-on-one, and I think I'm pretty good at it. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of different people over the course of my life, a lot of them in my clinical practice and elsewhere, and I have 500 hours of YouTube videos online that about 2 million people have watched now, and you know, I'm sure people have been combing them over with a fine-tooth comb trying to see if I've said anything that was vaguely inappropriate, and so far nobody's been able to call me on anything except, of course, these last videos. So, anyways, I told the university that after the second letter, which was an interesting letter, because it's been so interesting doing this, because one of the things that's happened is that at every opportunity, the people who have been opposing what I've been saying have been doing it in the most appalling manner that could possibly be hoped for. It's like being persecuted by the Three Stooges. Every time they attempt to maneuver me into a corner, they do it so badly that it ends up exposing what they're doing. So that's what happened with the free speech rally, where the professional activists absolutely disgraced themselves, and so like 4 million people have watched that. And then the university did the same thing with this letter, you know, where they basically validated the claims I made in the video. I said, look, looks to me like just making this video is illegal, which I thought was a problem. And not only that, in the policy it says, and this is something else you should pay attention to because this is horrifying. If you're an employer in Ontario, you are liable for what your employees say, just as if you said it. Even if the effects of their speech are, it doesn't matter whether the effects are intentional or unintentional, and it doesn't matter whether there's a complaint or not. So whatever the situation is that, well, you can figure that out for yourself. And you can go read the policy on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website. It's there in black and white for everyone to see. It's so insane. You know, one of the things the social justice warriors are doing, and this is absolutely terrifying, and it's coming your way, believe me, is that they're rewriting the fundamental legal doctrines that govern, I would say, that govern our deepest legal rights. So, for example, in the legal system, you're guaranteed innocence until you're proven guilty, but in the new sexual harassment policies, for example, that are being implemented at universities and producing what are essentially quasi-judicial bodies of inquiry at the universities, they've gone to preponderance of evidence, which basically means if the evidence suggests that you might have sexually harassed someone, then you did. So that's good. So you're guilty to begin with until you're proved innocent, and the standard is very, very low. And then the next thing they've done is wipe out intent. It's like if I say something to you and you get offended, what I meant is irrelevant. Think of that. It's crazy. It's completely crazy. And this is happening far faster than you think, and in far more places than you think. So forget about what you think you said. Forget about what your intent was. It's like, if you say something to me and I get offended, I can take you to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. And today at the debate they said, oh well, they probably won't throw you in jail. They had a lawyer there that said, well, that's probably what it result in jail, which by the way I think is absolute rubbish. And I looked into the law as much as I can. If I was fined and failed to pay the fine, they could hold me in contempt and put me in jail. And they already did that to someone in 2014. So that's rubbish. Well, so the punishment is there, and the punishment is profound. The constitutional lawyer that I went and talked to about being hauled in front of the Human Rights Tribunal said, he was rough on me, and he's a tough guy, and you would not like to have him on your case at a trial. Believe me, he's not agreeable from a trait perspective. And he raked me over the coals and basically said, Professor Peterson, you should shut the hell up and go back to your little life. Because if they take you to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, it'll cost you $250,000, and you'll pay the legal fees of your opposition, and you will lose. And that's a hell of a thing for a top lawyer to tell you when you're thinking about being hauled in front of one of these new kangaroo courts that have been foisted on us while we sleep in our ignorant slumber, not watching what's happening underneath our noses. So anyways, after the second letter, I went and talked to the Dean of Faculty of Art and Sciences, who was one of the people who wrote the letter. And he is a decent guy. You know, I would say he's a little too agreeable from a personality perspective. So I would say he's too easily pushed around, and he feels sorry for people too easily. And, you know, you think that's a virtue, but it's not. It's not a virtue. It is not a virtue. It's a temperamental proclivity at best. And feeling sorry for the wrong people just makes you naive. It makes you naive. And I'm telling you this technically. I have a lot of people in my clinical practice. A very common reason for people to come into my clinical practice is because they need assertiveness training. They're too naive and they can't stand up for themselves. And so I train a lot of people in how to be more assertive. Basically what I teach them to do is to be less compassionate and more honest. And you can tell if you're too compassionate because you're resentful. So you guys can all find out. It's like, are you resentful about things? It's because you're too agreeable. It means you have some things to say and you're not bloody well saying them. And it's eating away at your soul. And so what I teach my clients who need to be less agreeable and more assertive so that they can do things like negotiate for higher wages, for example, and stand up for themselves is, look, see if you're resentful. There's only two reasons if you're resentful. One is that you should grow the hell up and take some responsibility and quit whining, and maybe you can talk to some people and find out if that's your problem. And the second one is you're getting oppressed and you have something to say, and you know that. You know you do it, and you have to learn how to stand up and articulate yourself. So I teach people that sort of thing all the time. I think David Cameron is a little bit too on the agreeable side. Anyways, I went and talked to him and I said, look, I said, I know you sent me this letter, but hundreds of thousands of people have watched this video now and it's got immense press attention. Maybe there's an issue here. And so I said, well, why don't we have a debate? You know, why don't we have a debate? Why don't we model at the University of Toronto how a civilized discussion about these topics might be held? Because there's things to talk about here. You know, one of the things I thought about while I was doing this is, you know what you call people you can't talk to? Enemies. Right. And we should think about that. You look at how polarized the United States is. It's not good. And things can flip very badly in very short periods of time. And when people stop talking, and I think that's what's happened, the political dialogue in some senses has come to a halt. And the Americans in particular have divided themselves up into two increasingly distant camps. It's not good. It's not good. And you know what happens in the United States just happens here 10 years later. So we can look down there and think, well, it's heading our way. And I can certainly see this. The Canadian campuses aren't anywhere near as politically correct as the American campuses, but it's just because we're slow. It's not because we do things better. Anyways, to their credit, the university agreed to host the debate, and that was today. And so you can watch that online if you want. I'll put up an edited version of it on my website, or my YouTube channel, which is Jordan Peterson Videos. That happened today, and it was at that debate that I got denounced, I would say, by the sort of social justice warrior who's exactly the sort of person who would like to denounce you. And they also accused me of spreading hate propaganda. It's another thing that you should think about, because you know, even reasonable people can have a discussion about what constitutes reasonable limitations on free speech. You know, and you could say, well, you shouldn't be allowed to hate. It's like, first of all, that's not so obvious to me. So I've had clients who had plenty of reason to hate, and their reasons were valid, and sometimes you have reasons to hate that are associated with a demand for justice. Now that's a hell of a lot different than hating people because of their ethnic or racial identity, which is, you know, to say the least, counterproductive. But the problem with the argument even that freedom of speech should be regulated to reduce hate speech is that who the hell gets to define hate? And you know, let's say you were smart and you set up a little committee, like they've just set up in New York, by the way, right? Because now they have an anti-bias hotline in New York State. They've hired 50 policemen to police it. And so if you think you've been the victim, say, of biased perception that was even unintentional on the part of the speaker, you can call the anti-racism bias team and they will come and investigate. And that's happening all over campuses, by the way, all over university campuses, all over North America. Now the problem is, it's like, let's say we could find 5 people who were smart enough to define hate, right? And they were smart, carefully selected, wise people. It's like, then we grant them that power. Well, then we have a problem, because now we've localized that power. And even if those 5 people are going to be very judicious and careful with it, you can bloody well be sure that the people who replace them will be nothing of the sort, because those sorts of positions attract exactly the sort of people that you do not want occupying those sorts of positions. And so the way that you keep hate speech under control is you let the idiot haters out in public where they can babble mindlessly about their foolishness and get shredded by public opinion. And it has to be distributed among the public, because otherwise you have to give someone the power to regulate the damn speech, and as soon as you do that, you are screwed. And that's basically where we are. And, well, the debate happened today, and I can't tell how it went, although the people who watched it, although of course the people who talked to me about it were on my side, seem to think that it went quite well, and I'm hoping that it did, and I'll watch it and make my own conclusions, but at least the bloody debate happened. But it was of small satisfaction to me, and that's partly because it was obvious, even by the way the debate was set up, that I was fighting a rearguard action against something that's already occurred, and the universities have been taken over by politically correct authoritarians to the point where I don't think they're redeemable. What I would do, and I've been thinking, how the hell would you address this? This is what I think should happen. I think that the government should cut funding to universities by 25% and force no tuition increase. And I think they should make the faculty and administration cannibalize each other until the only people left are the people that are important. Because I think the universities do far. And I'm saying this as a great admirer of the universities, truly, and I say this with true sorrow, that I truly believe that the universities now do more harm than good, and that they are breeding grounds for fifth columnist activists who are profoundly opposed to all of the virtues that made Western civilization, who are so opposed to those virtues that they would be appalled to hear me claim that they were even virtues. And I would say that that was on full display today at the debate. And if you don't believe me, it's fine. I don't want you to believe me. I've never wanted anyone to believe me, for God's sake. You know, it'd be so. I tell my students, I'm going to tell you some things. They're outrageous. Think about them. If you can see any holes in them, if you can see any flaws in them, well, tell me what they are, because I've been thinking about this stuff for 30 years, and I can't poke any holes in it. So if you can do it, like, have at it, because I'd sure like to know. So, well, with regards to the university situation, go online. Go look at a dozen women's studies websites. Okay? Just read them for yourself. And I'll tell you what you'll find. You'll find a hybrid of Marxism and postmodernism. And the Marxists are aiming at equality of outcome. By the way, the training material that the human resources and equity people foisted on your staff insisted that if an organization wasn't characterized by absolute equality of outcome, this is in the training material, which means that at every strata of the organization, the representation by demographic category doesn't match the population precisely, that organization is corrupt and needs to be restructured. Equality of outcome. Right? And you know the Alberta Teachers Association, who introduced the gender unicorn to the indoctrination of children, have recommended that the children call each other comrade, because it's not gendered. And that's the absolute truth. You go look it up, Alberta Teachers Association. And that just blew me away. It was like, wow, really? Comrade? It's like, are you people that stupid? Are you that historically ill-informed? Or are you that malevolent? Because those are the options. Anyways, we had the debate today. And I think I did fine. And I think that my opponents, who I found very difficult to listen to, because all they did was buzz in their rhetorical, ideological way. They said not one thing that I didn't predict they would say, which is the hallmark of an ideologue, right? If I'm talking to you and you're telling me the truth, you're going to tell me weird and interesting things about yourself. And it's going to be fascinating. And I know this because I've spent tens of thousands of hours talking to people. If you get people to start telling you the truth, they're weird and interesting, like platypuses and kangaroos and rhinoceroses. People are strange and interesting when they're telling you about their own experience. And when they're ideologues, it's just buzz. It's like the background rattle of 1,000 identical demons. It's horrifying to hear, and it's impossible to listen to. And that's all I heard today at the debate. It's like, yes, as Solzhenitsyn talked about these sorts of people in the Gulag Archipelago. These were the communists that had been put in the camps and betrayed by their own system. You know, he said it was like there was, I'm paraphrasing, it was like there was a crank on the side of your head. You could just turn it and they would produce ideologically correct rubbish, and you could predict every word. And that's all I heard today. Those are people who are hypothetically going to be educating their children. It's like, send them to the damn trades where they could do something useful. Keep them the hell out of the humanities and even, I would say, even the social sciences. It's absolutely dreadful. So that's the whole story, I guess. And thank you very much for inviting me here and for taking time on a Saturday afternoon. And thank you very much for the...
There's at least one question that you would
yeah, so I grew up with parents who escaped communism, left Czechoslovakia after Prague Spring. So as a result of this, a very acute sense of the fears of totalitarianism in Canada. That's how I was raised. I wondered if you could comment on where we are in Canadian history right now. Are my parents' fears real? Where's the Overton window right this minute? Could you comment on that? I know it's a big question, but...
we're in a state of chaos, I would say. And I kind of use that term technically. A chaotic state is where there's so much up in the air, so to speak, that things could go in any direction. And I have no idea what's going to happen over the next year. I mean, things could settle back down like they did there was a big surge in political correctness in the early 1990s, and it calmed back down. I think the reason that happened was because this was in the States. I was in the States in 93 to 98. The economy was booming. And so I don't think that you can get a tremendous amount of ideological activism going in a really profound way without a good economic tremor. But I'll tell you, if we had a good economic tremor again, things could go badly south. Now, hopefully that won't happen, and hopefully, my wife had a dream. I do a lot of dream interpretation. And dreams are like they're like this. There's things you don't understand at all, right? And then there's things you understand quite well, and there's a border area between those two. And dreams are a part of the way that your mind starts to make sense out of that border area. And that's why dreams are kind of strange. They sort of half make sense, and the reason they half make sense is because they're dealing with things that you only half comprehend. And my wife's dream indicated, essentially, I can't go over in detail, but indicated that there was something we needed from a shop badly to stop the dogs from chewing on the wrong things. And the shop was closed, but it was still possible to get in the back door. And I think that's about right. I think this has gone a lot farther than people think. And I've tried to quantify this to some degree. The women's studies people and their ilk, let's say, I think have produced somewhere between 300,000 and 3 million committed social activists over the last, say, 10 to 20 years. That's a very rough estimate, and I did back-of-the-envelope calculations, but that's like 1% of the North American population who are committed to the demolition of the patriarchy. Read, committed to undermining Western civilization, because those things mean exactly the same thing. You don't need that big a percentage of committed people to really cause a substantial amount of trouble. And so why we allow our universities to continue doing this, I mean, I don't understand this. I mean, I can understand why it's difficult to do something about, but if we were producing neo-Nazis in university campuses, there'd be outrage. But we can produce like committed postmodern Marxists who have absolutely no more claim to ethical, no more ethical claim whatsoever, given what happened in the Soviet Union, say, and in Mao's China, and in Cambodia, and in Vietnam, and that we fought a bloody Cold War to stop and just about put the world to the torch. It's like why we fund these organizations that produce nothing but a continual onslaught of committed anti-Western civilization activists is beyond me. It's partly that we don't know how to stop them, but, well, I think if people don't stand up and stop this, then it won't stop. And if it doesn't stop, the countries that were overthrown by this sort of thing, Germany, say, on the right, obviously, and the Soviet Union, were no less civilized than we are. We're just as vulnerable to these doctrines as they were. And we don't have the bad examples of the Soviet Union and Mao's China anywhere to tell us just how pernicious and dangerous these doctrines are. So, it's anybody's guess.
I have a little comment and then question. First of all, I was really shocked to see how little resistance there is in Parliament to Bill C-16. Even look, the majority of the Tories are going to be supporting this, and it's not even going to committee or anything. I don't know whether it's come back yet, but it's going to be coming back very soon and be voted on.
Could you repeat the question? It's hard to hear.
But my question has to do with what are the implications for freedom of religion? I write for Catholic papers. I'm going to be writing a little article about this for them.
Yeah.
And so I was asked by my editors, what does all of this social justice warrior stuff, which has also infiltrated the church, what is this going to mean, and what should the churches do?
Tremble. The question is, what's the implications of all the social justice warrior activity for freedom of religion? Well, believe me, those people are no friends to religion. That's for sure. And so I would say, as long as your religion doesn't contravene any of the social justice warrior doctrines, and by the way, it does, then you'll be okay, as long as you're quiet, and I would say very quiet. And so Yeah, I've been interviewed by evangelicals in the United States and in North Carolina, and actually by the Catholic press in the UK, and you guys have every reason to be worried, like every serious reason to be worried. So,
Question sort of extrapolating from your speech, in light of the election south of the border, you make reference to working class and the lack of support for Democrats, and it's how strange they voted for Republicans. Do you see that election, and in its from macrocosmic terms, as a response to exactly what you're
absolutely.
talking about?
Yeah, the question,
And where do you think this goes?
the question is, was the election in the U.S. a response to the sort of things I'm talking about? Sure it was. I mean,
That would make the result
yeah.
good.
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question. Potentially, like, it depends, like I said, because we're in a period of crisis. I mean, Trump is an untested entity, to put it mildly, and, now, I'm concerned about that and not concerned about that. I think the best analog to Trump is probably Reagan, except Reagan had governance experience, and, maybe Trump, when I watched his acceptance speech, and then his interactions with President Obama, I detected, oddly enough, a tinge of humility, which is not something that you would, and I think he's shocked, and thank God for that, because he's quite narcissistic. And it's not that easy to shock a narcissist. And I think he was shocked by this, and hopefully he's overwhelmed enough by the magnitude of what's being thrust upon him that he will surround himself with very careful advisors. And I wish him luck, because bloody hell, he's going to need it. And maybe this will push back against the radical element on the left, but we'll see. The other alternative is to polarize people worse, and that's a higher probability. And the reason I think it's a higher probability is because it's a lot less difficult, right? You should always assume that the least difficult thing is going to happen, because for obvious reasons. And to increase the polarization between the left and the right would require basically nothing. It would require inaction and some errors. But we'll see. We'll see.
Can I ask speakers stand so that their questions can be better heard, and we'll go back there.
What's your read on the sciences and the engineering in terms of their trajectory?
You guys are so screwed.
I mean, almost 50 years ago, we throw snowballs at the people protesting the Dow Chemical.
Yeah. Well, the first people to go are going to be the psychiatrists. They have an anti-psychiatry program at Boise, right? They already have one. And they have a program on social justice. And the second most dangerous organization in Canada, after the Ontario Human Rights Commission, is the Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education, because they are not producing teachers. They are producing dedicated propagandists. And they are teaching social... They're teaching the tenets of radical social constructionism to your children, and I mean this technically speaking. So social constructionism is a doctrine that's derived both, I would say, from Marxism and from postmodernism, that insists that human identity is nothing but a social construct. And you need to insist upon that if you're a utopian, because if there's anything to human identity other than a social construct, right, a consequence of socialization, then you can't indefinitely modify human beings into your utopian ideal. And so the Soviets and the Maoists were radical social constructionists, technically and philosophically speaking, insisting that human beings were infinitely modifiable. It's a blank slate idea. Now, the idea that human beings is a blank slate, that is not a tenable scientific hypothesis. That hypothesis was, I think, thoroughly dispensed with in the 1960s. The behaviorists pushed it pretty hard and quite nicely, but their own behavioral investigations indicated quite quickly, because they were genuine scientists, that human beings had an intrinsic nature, and that's well documented in psychology and biology. But I think that proposition, I truly believe this, I'm not trying to be alarmist, I truly believe that proposition is now illegal. And the reason I believe this is because the policy guidelines on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website state explicitly that biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and by the way, gender expression is nothing other than your fashion choice. And I'm not being a smart aleck about this. It says right on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website that it's the manner that you present yourself in dress and hairstyle when doing day-to-day things like working and going shopping. That's actually what it says. That's the policy guidelines on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website. It's what you wear and how you do your hair when you go shopping. And criticizing that now is a hate crime in Canada. So congratulations to us. So anyways, we've instantiated a social constructionist dogma into the law. Good luck, biologists. So today, for example, when I was at this debate, I'm an expert in some areas of gender differences in personality. It's part of my research. My lab has done some of the fundamental work in that area. When we demonstrated, for example, that there are very fundamental differences in personality between men and women, enough so that if you sum the differences across all the different traits, you can almost segregate men and women completely without knowing their biological sex, so the differences are quite profound. All you women, you should be fighting for protection of that because you have interests, you have feminine interests. Now, some women are more masculine and some men are more feminine, but broadly speaking, women, for example, tend to be much more interested in working with people rather than working with things, and then have the opposite predilection, and that's to be associated with testosterone exposure in utero. It has nothing to do with socialization, or very little. You see the same damn thing among chimpanzees. So, anyways, once you get the social constructionist doctrine embedded into the legislation, it's then, well, you can't discuss biological differences between men and women anymore because it violates the tenets that are instantiated in the law. So what are you going to do? Is say, well, there are sex differences between men and women. Wait a second. You can't say that because the doctrine says that gender identity is separate from biological sex. And by the way, it's not, because 99.7% of people have the same gender identity as their biological sex, right? It's a tiny proportion of the transsexual community that debates the relationship between biological sex and gender identity. So it's the psychiatrists first. They've already got rid of Ken Zucker. They have an anti-psychiatry program. And Ken Zucker, like, he's just a scientist clinician. They call him a practitioner of conversion therapy, which was an absolute lie. All Zucker did, basically, was note scientifically, I think 200 of his colleagues signed a letter denouncing the Ontario government for scuttling his career because he's perhaps the most outstanding scholar on the topic in the world. He edits the damn journal where most of this stuff is published. He basically said, well, look, if you take kids who have gender dysphoria, so they're unhappy being boys if they're girls, or the reverse, and you just leave them the hell alone, about 80% of them figure out that they're gay, and then by the time they're midway through their adolescence, 90% of them settle into their biological identity. And so his attitude was, hey, let's go a little easy on the hormones and the knives, and just let the kids sort themselves out. That's illegal now. So, for example, if you took your 3-year-old child to the doctor and the child is insisting that that child is the opposite gender, the medical profession has no right, in fact is forbidden by law, to suggest that maybe the child's opinion could be, let's say, put on the shelf for a few years while they work it out. And it is illegal, and if you don't believe me, I can give you a good example of this. So Lauren Southern, the Rebel Media journalist, went to a physician. She's quite a, excuse the expression, she's quite a well-built blonde woman, which is partly why she's attracted so much attention online. She's very attractive and very definitely female. And she moved to Ontario from British Columbia a couple of months ago, and she decided that she was going to go test these new gender laws. So she went to a physician, just a walk-in clinic, and said, put her hair up inside a hat. Didn't really change much, but that's what she did. And she said, look, I've been, identifying as a man for the last year, and so I would like you to write me a note that I'm a man. So the doctor promptly wrote her a note saying that she was a man, and then, which shocked her, and then she took the note and went to the Ontario kiosk where you get your identification, and there was a nonplussed immigrant woman working there, and I don't know what she thought about what was going on, but Lauren said, well, look, now, but this time she's got her long blonde hair up and she's fully made up and she's got high heels on, and it's like, she says, I've got this note from a doctor and then I'm a man. I would like my government ID to be issued for me as a man. And so the woman behind the counter didn't know what the hell to do, why would she? And she phoned her supervisor, and her supervisor said, yeah, you could issue the ID, and so now she has ID as a man. So, wow. Yeah, wow is right. About 500,000 people have watched that online. So, scientists beware, because there's another thing that's built into this damn doctrine. So it's worse than social constructionism. It's not even coherent social constructionism, because the social constructionists at least agree that human identity is a consequence, say, of the interaction between the individual and society. They take it one step further. So they dispense with biology, introduce social constructionism, and then immediately dispense even with social constructionism, saying that your identity is nothing but what you say it is. That's built into the law. And that means you can be anything you want. And so that means you can occupy any position on the so-called gender spectrum, and it's not a spectrum, by the way, it's a bimodal distribution with some small exceptions, technically speaking, but it doesn't matter because spectrum's built into the law. And so they've actually undermined the concept of the objective world, because your identity is nothing but subjective. And so they're going to run into terrible trouble with that, because of course there are now 70 gender identities that are available on Facebook, and then there's the multiplication of these identities in the community called otherkins. And you'll hear a lot about otherkins. Yeah, it's not funny. It's so horrible and absurd that it's funny, like surreal. Surreal is funny, but the otherkins claim non-human identity, and that can be animal identity, bears. There's even a pronoun for people who identify as worms, and I'm not kidding. Worm self is the pronoun, and there's no reason under the doctrines that are now part and parcel of our law that those people cannot insist with exactly the same justification that you use their pronouns. And so it's bears, puppies. These are people who often have bears, puppies, kittens, deer, mice, lions, but worse, elves, fairies. Seriously, the LGBTQ has a Q plus now, and Q plus are the people who include the otherkins, and the otherkins are demanding non-human identity. But look, if identity is only subjective, if it's only your damn narrative that counts, and there's no such thing as the objective, which is what the postmodernists claim. That's what Jacques Derrida claims. And if you want to line up vicious, horrifying, nihilistic, demonic philosophers, Jacques Derrida would be at the top of the list. He claims there's nothing outside of the text. Everything is interpretation, and all categorization is just a power game. And so this is now instantiated into the law. Your identity is what you subjectively construe. It's like, and from a psychological perspective, of course, that's absolute rubbish, because that isn't what your identity is at all. Your identity, at minimum, is something you negotiate with other people, and it's predicated on a biological platform. And you can tell that because if someone cuts you, you bleed. And that's the proof of the biological instantiation of human identity. But that's all irrelevant to these bloody social justice warriors and the idiot politicians who've now allowed them to instantiate their pernicious and philosophically primitive and nihilistic doctrine into the bloody foundations of our law. Wow. And that's where we're at in 2017. Sorry. Yeah, you do this.
Okay. Yeah, I get the impression a lot of this is driven by and reinforced by mainstream media. You know, in my area, which is climate science, until 2 years ago, we had many of our dozens of scientists who don't agree with political correctness on climate change published in major Canadian newspapers, and it happened regularly. In the last 2 years, I'll send out an article with a leading scientist, and literally 40 newspapers will get the article, and maybe one will publish. And that's a big change in just 2 years, and I'm wondering, what do you think's going on?
Well, things can change very, very rapidly. You know, so what I would recommend, here's something I learned, and this is really cool. So the mainstream media is dead. They don't know it, but they're dead. And what's replaced the mainstream media fundamentally is YouTube. And YouTube is by no means dead, man. That is one vibrant and lively place. And I've noticed this partly because I was watching my social media stats, and I noticed that, like, if I got a CBC interview, nothing would happen. And then if I got like a YouTube interview with one of the big pundits, it's like, wow, my views would go through the roof. And I started to realize that for people under 30, all of the old media outlets, no one pays any attention to them. They don't believe them. And one of the things that's happened in YouTube that's so bizarre is that the less professional your YouTube presentation, the more people believe it. So for example, I've done a lot of work with TVO's The Agenda. You know, The Agenda is a pretty slickly produced show, and they have to gnaw off their leg to get 20,000 views. You know, whereas, well, the debate they held with me got about 150,000 views in a week, but that was partly because YouTube people took it apart and promoted it. So I would say if you want to communicate with young people, forget about the newspapers. Just put yourself in front of the camera and talk like a genuine human being in a very simple and straightforward way about what you have to say, and you'll get more people watching it than you could possibly believe. And all those people will care about, this is another thing that's cool about YouTube, they don't give a damn about anything but content. Now, well, and cute cat videos, of course. But YouTube is a very strange place, eh? And here's the way to think about it. So, for the first time in human history, a lecture has the same impact as a book. But the pathway to publication is as short as 1 day, and people can chop it up and comment on it instantly. And so, you know, reading is a foreign activity for human beings, right? We've only been reading roughly for 500 years, roughly speaking. But everybody's been listening for a lot longer than that, and people can listen to lots of things they can't read. And so I would say, if you have a non-standard message, you should promote it rigorously on YouTube, and people will attend to it, and just to hell with the regular media. They're done anyways, they're done.
Okay. No, not yet.
Sorry?
He's been
Professor
waiting a long
Peterson,
time.
sorry, I just have to make a comment similar to this lady, that her parents were from Eastern Europe. I grew up in Eastern Europe. My parents were both in the Holocaust. They are both survivors. So when it comes to evil, I'm there. It's in my genes.
Yes.
But what I find very interesting in what you're telling us about media is growing up in the system I grew up in, nobody believed any of the news. We all knew, in kindergarten, I knew that everything that people say is a lie. So you have it in you, you understand from a very early age that this is all pretense and a lie, and nobody pays attention to it. So I fought, I was refused 13 times exit from Eastern Europe to come to Canada. I didn't have a family there, I wouldn't want to have a family, I never would have had a family. I wanted to leave because I wanted to be free. And I arrived to Canada, thanks God, and I cried every morning when I took my son to kindergarten and listened to O Canada in the hallway as the kids were singing. 35 years later, I find myself exactly where I was under Ceausescu. That's where we got, and I keep asking myself whether I am delusional, mistaken. This was not the Canada I came to. This was not the country I cried every day.
Could you ask your question?
Yes,
please?
my question is the following. You are telling us fear. That's what we should do. I need you to give us some hope.
Oh, well, I would say...
Into what these people that came up here today to listen to you, we need to do something. There must be a way to get
Okay,
out
well,
of
so
this.
the fear question is a good one, because people have been asking me, for example, why I'm doing what I'm doing. You know, and people keep writing me and saying, well, yeah, I agree with you, but there's no way I would put my career on the line, and so forth. You know, many people have written me apologetic letters and frightened letters saying, well, you know, I'd like to speak up, but you know, the costs of doing so are incredibly high. But see, the thing about fear is you got to know what to be afraid of, and you got to know what your career is. Okay, so let's think about this carefully. So there's your career, that's your job, and like it's not trivial, it's bloody important, and you need it to hold your body together, but you bloody well need to hold your soul together too. And above your career is your integrity, and integrity is not some phantasm of the imagination. Like, integrity is what enables you to stand up to the onslaught of existence without becoming corrupted and terrifying. And you need your integrity. And so you have to think about this, because you can't live without your integrity. You'll be weak, and if you're weak, life will crush you, and as it crushes you, it will corrupt you and make you malevolent. That's what happens, because if you take an animal and you torture it, it will get vicious. And you can do that to yourself. And you do that by sacrificing your integrity, by sacrificing your right to think and your right to speak. You destroy your soul, and I understand how this works. I've studied it for years. I've seen how people destroyed their souls in these totalitarian communities, and then they destroyed everything, and they almost destroyed the entire planet. Be afraid. Be very afraid. But be afraid of the right thing. You're screwed both ways. So pick your catastrophe. And for me, really, and that's great advice for life. You're always picking your catastrophe. It's like there's no secure, happy place. Forget about that. That's not what life is like. That's why the great religious traditions insist. Life is suffering, and the truth sets you free, and that's the truth. And so, if people are intimidating you and making you afraid, be afraid of the right thing. Don't let go of your soul, because you will turn into a monster. And there's nothing more monstrous than a monstrous human being. And so you should be afraid of these people, but you should be far more afraid of giving in to them. So, for me, the ultimate fear... fear, and I mean this most sincerely, the ultimate fear was that if I had been placed in the position of an Auschwitz camp guard, that I would do what the Auschwitz camp guard did. And I decided back in 1985 that I was going to try to figure out how to live my life so that if that dreadful opportunity was offered to me, I would refuse it. And because I thought, well, that's what everyone has to do in the civilized world. It's like, we're very, very powerful as human beings. We've got this technology that's absolutely unimaginable in its power. And we have to become moral agents, or we will devour ourselves. And to me, I've looked at how you do that. You do that you start by doing that with yourself. And the thing that you do most particularly is you tell the truth. You tell your truth. And that doesn't mean you don't listen to correct you, because your truth is error prone, right? It's like, what the hell do you know? You got to listen to other people correct you, but you have to live by the truth. And more than that, I would say that this is the ultimate act of faith, and I think that this is the moral claim that is truly at the base of Western civilization. The moral claim is this: is that being can reveal its goodness to you if you speak the truth. And it's a claim of faith, and this is the claim. Well, you're ignorant people, you don't know anything, you don't know what the future is going to bring. You can't even justify your truth claims, you have to make a decision. So here's a decision. The best possible route is to tell the truth, and then see what happens. With the presupposition that if you tell the truth, what happens is the best possible thing that can happen, regardless of what your narrow, insular, and momentary perceptions might make of it. Well, and that's the leap into the unknown. That's the leap into the unknown that Kierkegaard described. You know? It's a leap of faith, and the alternative to that is absolute bloody mayhem, and the opportunity to live as slaves. It's like, you don't want to live as slaves, man. Maybe it's better not to live at all.
We've got to get that gentleman in the back.
All right, so I've been hearing in the news about a new thing that has been happening in the U.S. because of the Donald Trump win, where they're offering infant therapy, which is coloring books, Play-Doh, other things for university students, sophomores, and juniors and seniors as well. Do you think that this kind of ideology is self-defeating, and do you see any hope in the system being able to naturally correct itself?
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about that kind of infantilism, because I've thought about it a lot. Look, there's been some radical social transformations in the last 5 decades, and here's some things that have happened, and we haven't really contended with them. One of the things that happened is that people have far smaller families, right? So we have fewer children, maybe only one child. I think it's 1 point something or other. Like in Quebec, it's 1.2, something like that. So, and parents are having their children when the parents are a lot older. And so now we have this misbegotten idea that children are raised by parents. That's actually not true, especially in large families. Children are raised by other children in large families, and your siblings are not your best friends. They're going to put you in your place. You're not special to them. You're just a measly little brother. And if you get out of hand, you should get a good cuff. And children's play groups do that as well. So they're quite harsh agents of socialization. And what happens between the ages of 2 and 4 is that children are socialized well enough so that their peers will accept them into the play groups. And then a lot of socialization takes place between children from then on. Well, we've lost and interfered with that, and it's partly because, well, children don't have any siblings anymore. So, and that means that the parents have all their eggs in one basket, so to speak, and that means they get hyperprotective, plus they have the resources to do that. And so, part of it's a demographic transformation, and it's resulted in this generation of kids who have been afforded every opportunity, and who are thriving in some ways because of that, but who've been overprotected right from the time they're tiny, because they're actually too precious. And so we have to be sympathetic to that to some degree, from say a sociological perspective. There's a phenomenon occurring here, and I think that's part of the reason why children are sheltered much more than they used to be. But that doesn't mean it's a good thing. In fact, it's a terrible thing. I mean, one of the things that the psychoanalysts kept insisting upon at the beginning of the 20th century was, especially Freud, I mean, Freud's fundamental doctrine was that a tremendous amount of psychopathology occurred because children weren't able to extricate themselves from the grip of their parents, right? And so for the malformed psyche sort of striving up towards the light to take his or her place as a competent individual, they're being pulled back by the overprotective family embrace. And that was something that Freud often laid at the feet of mothers, and I think rightly so, although it also means that the father isn't in there counteracting that like he should. He was abdicating his responsibility and letting this unholy alliance between mother and child go far too far. I see a lot of that in my clinical practice. And so, but to promote this in universities is, well, even it's appalling, and it's being done by people who don't have the proper training in mental health treatments. Like, we know, if you're a clinician, there's a couple of things you do to help people overcome their timidity. And one of the things you do is you encourage them to expose themselves voluntarily to situations that they're afraid of. You don't coddle them, you don't tell them to go hide in the basement when they're afraid. If someone comes to me with social anxiety, I say, well, look, tell me what you're anxious about, and tell me something that you could do at a party that you think you could do, but that would frighten you. And then we'll rehearse that, so maybe you don't know how to shake someone's hand because no one ever paid attention to you when you were a kid, and so you're terrified at parties because you don't even know how to introduce yourself. So we practice like shaking hands and saying each other's names, and then I get the person to go out and go to a party and introduce themselves to 3 people, and they're all quaking away about that. And some people are very, very impaired. They have not been attended to. They're very timid. But you get them to go out there and face their fears. And you know what? That doesn't make them less afraid. It makes them more courageous. Right? Those are different things. Because courageous people move forward despite the fact that they're afraid. And everyone has reason to be afraid. It's like you're so vulnerable. I mean, you can be stripped of everything, right? I mean, and then you can be dead. It's like you have reason to be afraid. But you instantiate courage in people. And what we're doing with students, and partly in the United States, the reason the administrators are doing this is because they're coddling the kids so that they can steal their future paychecks. I'm not kidding. The administration has ramped up its representation in universities over the last 30 years to an almost incalculable degree. Tuition fees have shot through the roof. There's a whole generation of kids who are absolutely indebted upon emerging from increasingly useless university training, and they're indentured servants. And you know why? Because you can't declare bankruptcy on your goddamn student loan. So what happens is the administration has figured out how to pick the future pockets of its erstwhile victims, and it doesn't care if they're sitting half-formed infants in a salt bath while they're socking away their future earnings. So that's another reason why I think the damn universities do more harm than they do good, and that they should be starved until they wake the hell up and figure out what's important. So another speaker there.
Dr. Peterson, I listened to a number of your online talks, and I was thinking, what will I ask you? And this is a question that's been going through my mind. It's a 2-pronged question. So number one, I've been thinking, how can a post-Christian world stand up to the encroachment of the social justice
can't.
movement? So that's number one. And number two, I'm wondering, what is your, where do you stand in terms of your spirituality?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. Watch my videos. And that's the best I can do. So if you watch, I have a course online called Maps for Meaning. There's 40 hours of lectures, and that explains it. And I cannot simplify that. Now I can simplify it to some degree, I guess. So I guess I'm wrong. I can simplify it to some degree. So there's a principle at the heart of Western civilization, and it's older than Christianity, and it's older than Judaism, although both Judaism and Christianity developed it to a great degree. The Jews especially with the prophetic tradition, and the Christians more with the metaphysical idea of the Word. And so the idea is, it's the idea of the logos, and the logos is also the root word of logic, but logos means something like coherent, interpersonal communication of the truth. And from an archetypal perspective, it's the action of the logos that extracts order from chaos, and that's really the meaning of the first chapter of Genesis. And it's an old idea. It's embedded in Mideastern mythologies that might be, we don't know, tens to hundreds of thousands of years old. And the idea is that what being is a chaotic admixture it's a chaotic admixture. And the way that human beings interact with that and make it habitable is through articulated truth. We make order with articulated truth, and then we inhabit the order. And the order is the negotiated social agreement that we've all come to, right? So that we can live among each other without tearing each other to shreds, which is basically what chimpanzees do to one another. So we have to negotiate the social order, and we do that through articulated speech. And then what Christianity did was take that proposition, which was derived partly from Mesopotamia, and partly from Judaism, partly from Egypt, and turn it into what would you call it, a symbolic doctrine. And so they took the figure of Christ, who's the ideal man from an archetypal psychological perspective, just means the ideal man. Right? So it's an image of the ideal. The ideal is the Word made flesh, and what that means is the instantiation of the logos in the body so that it's acted out in the world. It's the fundamental proposition of Western culture, and we've lost it, and we will not survive without it. And that's why people like Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, when they were talking to the Russians, they said, look, the proper course of Russian development is to return to Russian Orthodoxy and to develop it forward into the future. A very difficult thing to do, because the fundamentalist Christians, particularly, but I would say the Christians in general, can't distinguish between their truth claims and the truth claims of science. And they tend to insist at a philosophical level that the truths that are embedded in mythological structures are of the same type as scientific truths. And they're not. Scientific truths are descriptions of what is, right? Mythological truths, religious truths, are descriptions of being and guidelines to what ought to be. So you can say that there's two things you need to know in the world. One is what is. That's the objective world. What's the objective world? But that's only half of what you need to know. The other half is what you should do about it. And that's the primary existential issue. How to act in the world. Well, religious doctrine is about the world as a place to act. It's not about the world as a place of objects. That's science. And there's no contradiction between the two, except that we don't have the philosophical discrimination to distinguish between them. Now, Heidegger started to do that with his analysis of being. But that wasn't, he didn't do that within a Christian framework, but for all intents and purposes at the moment, that's irrelevant. Jung started to do it, Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, you see, Carl Jung was a student of Nietzsche, and also Freud. Now, Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced back in the late 1800s that God was dead. And when you know that, quote, Nietzsche said God was dead, but what you don't know probably is the context within which he said that in the Gay Science. He said, I paraphrase, God is dead and we have killed him and we will never find enough water to wash away the blood. It wasn't a triumphalist statement on Nietzsche's part. He predicted that millions of people would die in the 20th century as a consequence of the ascendance of communist ideology. He predicted that in like 1880. It's unbelievable. And Dostoevsky knew exactly the same thing and predicted that in The Devils, in his great book, The Devils. So we have no cornerstone in our culture. We've come unmoored. And We oscillate from the radical right, hyper-order, to the radical left, hyper-chaos, and millions of people die with each turn of the snake, let's say. We have got nothing to keep us centered. And what keeps people centered, whether they know it or not, is the logos. They just don't understand what it means. Now, Carl Jung elaborated that in great detail in his unbelievably difficult and terrifying works, and did it brilliantly, brilliantly. But Jung is a hard nut to crack, and most people read him, and first they don't understand, and so they quit, and then if they start to understand, then they really quit. So, because the problem, the thing about the philosophy that's instantiated, say, in Jungian psychotherapy, in the Jungian model, is that it requires personal responsibility above all else. And one of the things I figured out a long time ago, so imagine you could give people a choice. Here's your choice, people. On the one hand, your life is meaningless. You're just a speck in a cosmic landscape, and the brief time that you inhabit being is worth nothing. That's one option. And people think, well, that's a terrible option, that's a nihilistic option. How can I tolerate the suffering that's attendant on my life with no countervailing meaning? Perfectly reasonable question. Here's the alternative. Everything you do matters. Everything you do matters. And you have to bear the responsibility for that. Every decision you make determines the destiny of the cosmos. That's meaning. Now, which one do you want? Well, that's easy. People will take meaninglessness and nihilism over that burden any day. It's like, I wish I had a meaningful life. It's like, well, really? Do you? Really? Really? You're prepared to bear, let's say, infinite responsibility for each of your choices, because that's meaningful. No, people will shrink away from that. And no wonder they shrink away from that, like animals shrink away from a fire, and it's perfectly understandable, but we don't get to shrink away from that anymore. Not without their being held to pay.
We're running out of time, so I'll take two quick questions. David and then the lady.
You focused quite a bit on the universities and how they've really become lost. And if we go back in history, the universities were the sort of the leading edge of culture and of thought. Free speech was sort of their founding principle, and yet it seems that they've become the weakest part of our society. How do you think that happened? What was the weakness?
Well, I think a huge part of it, well, it's an extension of what I just described, is that, you know, Western culture has come unmoored. And then there's a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is the contradiction between the Enlightenment and rationality and our classic, let's say, evolved mythological structures. You know, I mean, people tend to think that religious belief is arbitrary in some sense, and nothing could be farther from the truth. It's perfectly self-evident if you do the research and you look at it, that our religious presuppositions are instantiated into our biological being. Religion is a human universal. Right? And the reason for that is because we have to organize how we act, and we can only do that according to a set number of principles. So the principle is, like, let's say you and I want to play a game, and so the game has to have some rules, and one rule is it has to be a game, right? So it has to have a point, because otherwise it has no meaning, and then for it to be a good game, you have to want to play, and I have to want to play. And then furthermore, when we play, the game has to sustain itself. Well, so that's what society is like. Society is a game that everyone plays that sustains itself. And there are very, very few forms of social structure that will actually allow that to occur. And so human societies tend to settle into types of regular patterns that they're not just embedded in our human physiology, they're way older than that. We share a lot of the structures with chimpanzees, and we share structures that we don't share with chimpanzees with all mammals, and even farther back than that, you know. These things are deeply embedded inside of us, and Western society has lost the symbolic landscape that enables us to connect our fundamental instincts, I would say, with our conceptual schemes. And so our conceptual schemes have become unmoored, and we're weak. We can't tolerate a challenge. We can't tolerate an internal challenge. And if we're ever faced with a vicious external challenge, which is highly probable, the chances that we're going to be able to withstand that are minimal. We've got no strength of spirit, and we're paying a huge price for that. And I do see, because I've thought about this in great detail, as I suppose you can tell, I've been decomposing the social justice argument, and because things exist at multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The best model for reality, by the way, is a symphony. right? You think about, that's why a symphony is so deeply meaningful. That what a symphony does is lay out complex patterns at multiple levels of analysis, and that instantiates a profound sense of meaning in you because you're participating in the harmony of being. And everyone knows that when they listen to music. They just don't know they know it. And we can't participate in that harmony of being anymore because we don't understand what it is, and because our rational faculties, we've allowed our rational faculties to saw the branch off that we're sitting on fundamentally. And so there's a tremendous amount of education that has to take place. Look, I'll give you one example of this. It's kind of a strange example, but you know, you've all watched Pinocchio, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, Pinocchio is this puppet, and his father hopes that he'll become a real individual, which is a hell of a thing for a father to hope for, right? That's a story of individuation, the development of the autonomous individual. So it means Geppetto's a good guy. He doesn't want some slave that he can just pull the strings of. And so he wishes on a star that Pinocchio will become a genuine individual, which means he lifts his eyes up above the heavens and makes a transcendent gesture. And that invites Mother Nature to play her part. That's the blue fairy. And then Pinocchio is subject to a variety of existential temptations. One is lying, another is being an actor, which is someone who's a pretense, only pretense. Another one is to be enticed into neurotic pain, because the fox and the cat, for example, convince him that he's sick, and that's what makes him vulnerable to totalitarians on Pleasure Island. It's a brilliant little archetypal story, which is why it's been popular for decades. When Pinocchio has turned into a brain jackass after being educated on Pleasure Island, right? Just prior to being sold to the salt mines, he doesn't quite turn up enough into a jackass to become a complete slave. He has to go down into the depths, to the lowest part of the ocean, to the thing that he fears most, and he has to revivify his father. That's the oldest story we know. It's Gilgamesh. I'm saying seriously that it's the oldest story we know. We have to revivify our dead father. That's how you become a genuine individual. We're not doing it. We think it's a corpse. It's a corpse. That's Nietzsche's point. We'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. We've abandoned our traditions. And that's a very bad idea. If you abandon your traditions, this is the Mesopotamian story, the Enuma Elish, which is literally the oldest written story we have. In the initial parts of the Enuma Elish, the careless crowd kills their father, Apsu, who's the great god of order, and tries to inhabit his corpse, which is basically the story of civilization. We inhabit the corpse that our ancestors have moved forward to us. When the goddess of chaos finds out that the inhabitants of the Mesopotamian landscape have killed order, she breeds every possible form of monster, puts the devil himself, roughly speaking, at the head of her phalanx of monsters, and comes at people. Well, that's what happens when you destroy your tradition. It's like it's either order or chaos, folks. What are you going to have? And I know order can get out of hand. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But chaos is no preferable option. And you know, we see kids 18. I see this all the time happening in universities. These kids are bent up and deformed. They're half-formed people. They haven't been paid attention to enough. They've never been educated. They're timid. They don't know how to talk. They can't write. They can't think. They know nothing about history. And they're sort of struggling into the universities. And what the goddamn professors do is say, you know those shreds of wood that are keeping you afloat in the sea of chaos? That's all rubbish. You're an idiot for believing it. How about if I just take those away? And then the kids are left with freedom. They have exactly the same freedom as someone you take, strip naked, and drop into the middle of the ocean. It's like swim in whatever direction you want. You're free. I see this all the time. I think that the universities not only are corrupting our social institutions, but they're taking our adolescents who are already weak and unformed and stripping them of any possibility whatsoever that they have of not descending into catastrophic nihilism. And I don't say that lightly. I know the bloody mental health stats on campus. And the state of the mental health of the students is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And most of it's depression and anxiety. It's exactly what you'd expect. Because just try living as a nihilist. Good bloody luck.
One more question.
You mentioned that tradition is dying, and I believe, at least I see it in my profession as an immigration lawyer, that we are importing traditions, solid multi-generation tradition with the immigrants who are coming to Canada. And I see this in my office when my clients come to me and they are confronted with this nonsense, and that's what they dismiss it as nonsense, and they don't allow their children to be brainwashed. And if we continue the immigration policy, which I don't necessarily agree with in all aspects, but I believe that if we bring in immigrants who have religious beliefs and old-fashioned, solid traditions, they will not fall prey to what is happening in Canada. And I don't think any Human Rights Commission is going to go after a Somalian or a Filipino or a black African or a Muslim for impolitically correct views. So my question is, do you see a glimmer of hope with this type of immigration with people who have traditional beliefs and culture?
Well, one of the things that happened in Ontario quite recently was, that there's been a continual alliance between the immigrant community and the Liberal Party because of the Liberal Party's liberal policies on immigration. And that's certainly understandable. But you saw a bit of a rebellion against that with Kathleen Wynne's new sex education curriculum, right? And it was happening for exactly the reasons that you described. I would say though that I don't see immigration as a solution to the malaise that operates within Western culture, because it's not that easy to bring people from all over the world and integrate them. You need a coherent doctrine, so to speak, a coherent, let's say, Canadian set of values to bring these people together. And we keep abandoning that, and the idea that multiculturalism is multiculturalism. Like, if you're a follower of Thomas Hobbes and not a follower of Rousseau, multiculturalism is the state of everyone against everyone else. I mean, if you look at primordial human beings in their tribal landscape, most people are at war with one another all the time. The rates of murder go through the roof. You know, the idea of the noble savage, that's really a seriously bad idea, man. That is not true in the least. And so, I don't see any hope for peace in bringing immigrant communities together without something to unite them. Although I do agree with you that many of the immigrant communities actually bring with them quite conservative values, speaking from, like, as a small c conservative, and that if the conservative government, if the conservative parties had a ghost of any sense, which they don't, they would be appealing to the immigrant communities for exactly that reason. Say, look, it turns out that you guys are allied yourself with the Liberals because of their immigration policy, and maybe you've been a little bit slow in the uptake in that regard, but don't be thinking about this, is that your values as an immigrant, a conservative immigrant, are much more in keeping with small c conservative values than they are with, especially with social justice, radical left values. And so maybe there's a hope that the immigrant communities can be brought on board, so to speak, to act as a bulwark against this insane nihilism, but that would require political leadership of a very particular sort.
We're going to have to leave it at that for now. I'll just take a couple of seconds to wrap up, and I invite you to come and meet Dave, Peter, exactly, his name, Jordan.